Barnaby Joyce, he just was on the front foot a few moments ago. He is responding to that front page spread in the Australian today. And he says that methane emissions had to be excluded from the deal. It's essentially an ag carve-out. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, hi Pete, and thanks for having me on. Look, I've only just caught up a little bit with what's happened, extraordinary as usual from Barnaby Joyce, but I think we've been trying to get an understanding of what is in the deal between the Prime Minister and the National Party all week in estimates, and nobody's been prepared to talk about it. But obviously Barnaby's keen to let out a few of those elements of the deal before the Prime Minister gets ahead of himself and leads the country at Glasgow. So I think it's just another warning from the National Party that it's actually not the Prime Minister calling the shots here, but in fact the National Party who are actually against net zero by 2050.
Is what Barnaby said this morning really extraordinary though? Because, I mean, his concerns are that if you've got to cut methane emissions by up to 30% when it comes to the agriculture industry anyway, then that's going to involve the culling of cattle and a large proportion of them, which would alarm farmers greatly, wouldn't you agree?
Well, I was more referring to extraordinary conduct by the Deputy Prime Minister, essentially telling the Prime Minister what he can and can't do in Glasgow. As to the details of what the carve-outs are or what the arrangements of the deal, that's precisely why we've been trying to get an understanding of what it is, so that we understand what Australia's position is, what the government is taking to Glasgow on behalf of the country. You know, as to the details of what those carve-outs are, well, I just think the government should be upfront about what they are so we actually can understand what the limitations of the agreement are. Personally, I don't know enough about what the arrangements are to comment on it, but
sure.
It just again shows that that it's not the Prime Minister leading this debate. Let's just say that it's Barnaby Joyce, and when he's a bit worried about where the Prime Minister's going, he calls a press conference to make it clear to the Prime Minister what he isn't allowed to do.
But would you be comfortable with farmers having to cull cattle?
Look, that isn't Labor's policy at all. And again, you know, part of what we've been saying in terms of taking a serious and credible climate policy to the next election is, you know, let's see what happens at Glasgow, see what the parameters are, and then we will work through, in consultation with a range of stakeholders, including those that work in the agricultural sector, farmers. Of course, they are important as to what happens and what Australia's position is as we work towards net zero by 2050. We need to do it sensibly, we need to work together, and we need to understand what the full implications of any proposed arrangements are.
OK, so by that measure, when the US and some European nations are basically demanding the world cut their methane emissions by up to 30%, it's fair enough that the Prime Minister says no.
Well, again, let's see what happens at Glasgow. I mean, I have not been briefed on what the various sub-elements of the negotiations are going to be at Glasgow. It's absolutely important that the Prime Minister stands up for Australia's national interest and represents our local economy. That is absolutely clear. Any Prime Minister should do that, and understands the impact of any international arrangement on our economy. So absolutely, you know, we should work through that detail. I guess what's not clear to me is the decisions that have already been taken. And it seems to me from what Barnaby has just said this morning is there's a whole range of elements of the secret deal that have already been determined that don't allow the Prime Minister to engage in a whole range of discussions in Glasgow because the National Party room have already determined it for him.
Labor says it will legislate net zero emissions by 2050. Barnaby Joyce has turned the question on you this morning and asked you, what is the legislation that you specifically intend to use?
Well, we have said that we would legislate a target. I mean, that is what business is asking for. Let me be clear about that. Part of what needs to happen is the government of Australia needs to lead the way, set the target. Then what needs to happen is we need to enshrine it in legislation so that the certainty and confidence that will attract business investment not just in Australia, but around the world, into building Australia's into the renewable energy powerhouse of the world, can actually be delivered upon. And business have made that clear to me in many, many discussions that, particularly after the decade of climate wars and uncertainty in this area of policy, they want certainty. Legislation would give them that.
Would you like to see a shorter-term target closer to what the Business Council of Australia is demanding?
Well, I think the discussion about what happens over the next decade is really important. It's clear that the actions that are taken up to 2030 will, in a sense, set the path for what needs to happen between 2030 and 2050. We know we're pushing up against it. So definitely there needs to be a pathway of what you're going to do up to 2030.
Yeah.
So some medium term. You can't get to 2050 without mapping out you get there. Like, it's not all going to happen in 2049, as much as Barnaby Joyce might like to want it to occur. So sensible, credible climate policy will set out medium-term goals and a pathway to get there, that's for sure, and it needs to happen.
Is there an opening to go big target there? Has the BCA given you an opening?
Well, I think, again, there's a range of views about what an appropriate target might be. We're going to look at what happens in Glasgow, discuss it in our caucus about the right thing to do. But I can guarantee you it will be more ambitious than 26 to 28, which is what the governments, essentially pin themselves to, and whatever the states and territories do.
What about higher than 35?
Sorry?
What about higher than 35%, which is the current modelling?
We don't have a medium-term target at this point in time. We have said we'll wait to see what happens with Glasgow, but I can assure you, Pete, that we will have policies that set out a pathway to achieve sensible reductions in emissions on the way to 2050.
OK, but I meant higher than not 2035, 35% of 2005 levels.
Yeah, I understood.
It's going to be higher than that. Sorry, yeah. So it will be higher than that.
I understood. Hey, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I said was we will map out, we don't have a target, we don't have a medium-term target, but we will watch what happens at Glasgow, and I can guarantee you our policies will map out a credible path to net zero by 2050, including a focus on what happens over the next decade.
OK. Katy Gallagher, appreciate your time as always. We'll talk to you soon.